Hello and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and broader strategic issues in focused detail so you can build a clearer and more accurate big picture. So I have with me, as usual, Arslan Khan. Hi Arslan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So let's just dive right into it. According to the Taliban's Ministry of Defense, Russia has agreed to sell or help them maintain some air defense equipment. Do you want to get in on that?
Yeah, so obviously we've seen this in the news recently, and we've seen this, and actually I think even a leaked a press report from the Afghan side. Yeah, so we've seen this in the news, and it's a cause for concern, right? Because it's not a case of the Taliban having air defense that's going to be a problem, but it's a case of what can happen with that air defense. And I don't mean they pose a threat to our fighter jets, but the concern is so with this, I would assume that it would be more focused around stuff that the Russians aren't really worried about losing, MANPADS or maybe like SHORADs like the Pantsir or whatever. Firstly, the Taliban probably doesn't have any sort of capacity to operate this kind of beyond MANPADS, anything else. I can't think of I think the last time the Afghans had an air defense network was probably pre-Soviet times. So obviously, there's a couple of angles here. Is firstly, we're probably going to see Russian contractors returning to Afghanistan to operate these kinds of air defense systems. But also, the concern is now that if the Taliban is to get fresh MANPADS, what's stopping them from, what's stopping a rogue commander from just, selling off a MANPADS to another organization, or, and the proliferation of MANPADS in our area. Now, there's always, if we look at NOTAMs and whatnot, for Afghanistan particularly, most countries have banned or, suggested that operators fly above, 25, 30,000 feet because of the MANPAD threat. However, what's stopping an actor from getting their hands on some MANPADS and then using them against the airliner on approach, for example, into, Karachi or Gwadar or Islam, or anyway, and that's the big concern here is now that Afghanistan is possibly able to get access to functioning air defense. It's not a case of that, the idea that they pose a threat to our fighter aircraft is probably secondary to the bigger concern, which is it may be a dangerous thing for everyone around the world that the Taliban is getting its hands on air defense that isn't necessarily traceable and can be sent and deployed to anyone or anywhere. And I think the timing is obviously quite interesting. If we look, Russia is struggling quite hard in Ukraine. They need more men for the meat grinder, and the Taliban are a bunch of barbarians who want to fight. So it sort of aligns quite well with what the Russians are needing at the moment, and what the Taliban has always wanted, which is air defense. So, could this be a troops for arms deal type thing, where the Russians get access to, battle hardened troops who, have nothing to lose, and in exchange for air defense, which is what they so desperately need. But on top of that as well, we don't actually know the full extent of this deal. We could end up seeing some Russia drones as well involved in this deal. The Taliban, of course, they've deployed their own loitering munitions. We saw that for the first time recently. But on top of that as well, we could see potentially Russian loitering munitions be integrated into Taliban arsenal. And other than that, there may be some support for some of the legacy systems that the Taliban have access to refurbish them. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head, but, one of the biggest things the Taliban had always wanted was access to Scud missiles, which I don't think the Russians would do because the backlash would be immense, not just from Pakistan, but globally. But just, back to the original point that I think if anything, if anything comes of this, the Taliban will get access to a fresh set of MANPADS and maybe some short-range air defense stuff. But I think both the Russians and the Afghans will face significant backlash from literally everyone, the Indians, the Chinese, West, everyone over this, because it doesn't only pose a threat to Pakistan, but it poses a threat to every airliner, to every aircraft, and to every country in the region and possibly beyond as well.
Yeah, so my take on this is that I think Russia's incentive structure is they basically want to build a partnership with the current Afghan regime. I think Russia and even China, they really do prioritize stability, find pathways to start exerting some level of influence within the regime itself. I think that's really where the Russians are probably beginning to approach this from, because they've had that in Afghanistan in the past before, in the lead up to the occupation and right until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in that sense, I can see where the Russians are coming from. That being said, the statement that the defense minister, the Afghan Taliban defense minister basically made was that he basically said that as a result of this military cooperation, Pakistan would not have the confidence to engage in airstrikes in Afghanistan in the future. What this tells me, number one, this is for the domestic audience right away. Because for a matter of fact, forget MANPADS, the PAF has operated in air defense environments that have been far more dense and complex compared to MANPADS, right? I mean, they literally targeted the S-400 in India. PF knows how to operate in an air defense environment, right? Even if the Taliban were to build a more complex setup with multi-layered defenses, let's say short to medium range even, then the PF would then have to action in the suppression and destruction of enemy air defense protocols that they already have built, right? You might even bring in the Army Rocket Force Command to go in and essentially also use land-based strikes as well. So in that sense, I don't think from a technical standpoint, the PF is concerned. I think a lot of what's happening is domestic posturing for the IEA to essentially build its credibility, especially on the back of the fact that the PAF did conduct airstrikes in Afghanistan. You could argue that to an extent, the wider power brokers that the Kabul regime has to rely on, they've lost a little bit of confidence in Kabul, right, in recent months. So it could be that he's trying to establish that, look, we're taking steps to make sure that that stuff doesn't happen again in the future. How he'll be able to guarantee it, that is an open question. I wouldn't be surprised if it's overblown in that context. Maybe he's not getting as much from the Russians as he's implying, because as you said, for the Russians, there's a lot of risk involved, right? I mean, it could even blow back directly onto them. Like, it could also be that those same, MANPADS and what have you end up getting used on the Russians somehow down the line. I mean, it's not inconceivable. That's my perspective on
Yeah,
it.
I mean, just to touch on the medium and short, long range systems. I mean, I think stuff that like that, which is a lot more visible, it's a lot more detectable, it's a lot more, it's not something that's hard to track. I think the biggest concern for me personally is the proliferation of MANPADS in the region, and that's always been a concern for everyone. If we talk about the Operation Cyclone, the CIA had a buyback program for MANPADS to ensure there was nothing left in the region, because the reality is insurgent networks like these, they're not as structured as something like a conventional army. They're not as they don't have loyalties like that to something like a unified state or whatever. But they also have a ton of personal relationships, right? These guys are guys that there might be guys in somewhere like Uzbekistan where they fought with, or in Chechnya or whatever. The point is that they also have personal relationships, and what's stopping one commander who has access to a MANPAD storage site or whatever, and from selling one under their nose. And this is the concern here, is what's stopping these from eventually making their way into Balochistan or Fatah, or anywhere for that matter. Hell, these could end up in Kashmir as well. There's literally nothing preventing that. And because these are so hard to track, I would argue that these are probably a far bigger threat than something like let's pretend the Afghan Taliban gets access to S-400s, for example. I would argue that the MANPAD threat is probably even more significant than something like that, because those they're not difficult to spot, they're not difficult to hunt down, they're not difficult to track. But and MANPAD, you're going to really struggle to go ahead and tear apart these proliferation networks when we're talking about stuff like MANPADs. Just ask the CIA, they had a very difficult time ensuring that there were none left in the region. I mean, they worked really hard to make sure that doesn't happen. So it's quite concerning. And and I would bring this back to, and I would really talk about Pakistan's policy failures here, right? And this isn't really my place, and Asim will probably do a far better job in pulse check on this kind of stuff. But this is really a great example of Pakistan's policy failures, where Pakistan played this tightrope balancing act between Ukraine and Russia, and it just baffles my mind, because Ukraine has been a partner that's always been reliable for Pakistan. Ukraine has, the Ukrainian industry has supported Pakistan greatly in its defensive programs, whether we talk tanks, aircraft, missiles, cruise missiles, engines, propulsion, everything. The Ukrainians have been there for. Hell, the Ukrainians to this day still support Pakistani aircraft programs, whether we talk about the IL-76. In fact, they recently overhauled them, and they sent technicians, even now, currently sending technicians to keep these aircraft in the air. And then also when we talk about the RD-93, where a lot of the support comes from Ukraine. And it just brings me back to the policy failures. Russia is an adversary. It has been arming our adversaries, India, and even to an extent Iran. Then you've got the Russians, and obviously their involvement in Afghanistan back in the day. We've never had amazing relationships with the Russians, because they've always been on the other side. Hell, the Russians had involvement with the BLA and whatnot as well. And then walking this weird balancing act, there was nothing to gain from a Russian relationship with Pakistan. There was none of this oil stuff that they fantasized about. There was no political gains. There was no diplomatic gains, no financial, no defense, nothing. There was nothing to gain from that relationship. However, the Ukrainian relationship was far more beneficial for Pakistan, not only if we look at it from a perspective of Ukraine, but also winning favor in somewhere like Europe, where, if we look at the US, obviously the US is, the Pakistan-US relationship is probably an all-time high right now. And that's not materialized into anything we've seen, obviously, but, we don't know what's going on behind closed doors. However, the problem is the US-Pakistan relationship has always been very dependent on who's in office. The European relationship, however, isn't really as dependent on, who's running the show at what time. It's kind of just generally been, either good or bad. And Ukraine would have been a massive way of winning favor in Europe. And, people might sit there and say, well, why do we care about Europe? We have China, whatever. But China doesn't hold large amounts of Pakistani diaspora. China doesn't hold large amounts of Pakistani remittance. China isn't, Europe is a massive trading partner. So while people, they love to put all their eggs in one basket, but supporting the Ukrainian cause had far greater implications and far greater upside than this weird tightrope balancing act between Russia and Ukraine, playing this ambiguity card. I think it's a ridiculous policy. It's a really poor policy. And I sincerely hope that we can wake up and start throwing our weight behind Ukraine, who has been a reliable partner for Pakistan, and as a means of punishing Russia for these kind of actions, because this directly impacts our security, and that's something the Taliban has said. So, and at the end of the day, if there is systems in Afghanistan, they're going to be operated by Russians and crewed by Russians. So, what does that say?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think it was through the mid-2010s until around the start of the Ukraine war, where we had this very overt focus on trying to engage the Russians, even though, and obviously, just to be clear, India pays them in hard cash. But the fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, the Russians do choose to basically proliferate very advanced technology to the Indians, including, for example, the guts that went into the BrahMos missile, for example, right? And even to this day, you can argue that there's probable collaboration on, supersonics and hypersonics between India and Russia, essentially. So Russia is providing such crucial, game-changing military capabilities to India. And again, just to be clear, we're not complaining here in the sense that, oh, why is Russia doing this? We understand India pays in cold hard cash. The issue that we have here is that it's on Pakistan's end, that this is a policy failure on Pakistan's side. Because understanding that there is a symmetry in relations, that the way the Russians will favor the Indians, you need to now take that and basically start, logically speaking, counteracting Russia's interests, right? So for example, as you said with regards to Ukraine, I remember back in and we wrote about this in Kua back in 2015, 2016, 2017, Ukraine used to proactively engage Pakistan and offer Pakistan a lot of collaboration, not just in the way of, let's say, aircraft programs, tanks, and armored equipment, but right down to even upstream assistance and support. Like, we had opportunities where we could have worked with Ukraine in developing some of the upstream industrial capabilities, like in steel, for example. At the time of the Soviets, after the core Russian state, it was Ukraine that held the R&D capacity within the Soviet Union. So, for example, whether it was in terms of gas turbines, steel, even to an extent aircraft design, definitely armored vehicles, it was Ukraine. Ukraine was the place where that was happening. In fact, some of the Indian Navy ships, they used to rely on propulsion imported from Ukraine. So when tensions between Russia and Ukraine started around, in the late 2010s, the Ukrainians shut off or basically cut access to those propulsion systems, which at a point delayed some Indian naval programs. Right? This is to show you that the Ukrainians were, they were not a light hitter. Yet, for some reason, and I can understand Pakistan's top national security and foreign policy leadership having, failure tendencies. And we had some people accuse us of being pro-PTI. No, just to be clear, a lot of this whole pro-Russia bent happened during the time of the PTI as well. So again, we care about policies. We don't care about parties or personalities. We care about policies here. And the pro-Russia policy is actually a problem that affected multiple Pakistani parties and leaderships. So that included in very embarrassing ways, the Imran Khan government as well, who happened to be in Russia right at the dawn of the actual Russia-Ukraine war, right? That being said, each Pakistani government would just go out of its way and just, borderline shamelessly try to appease the Russians, say that they want relations with the Russians. And then with that, unfortunately, and this is where the failure really comes in, and the part that really annoys me, is that the wider intelligentsia behind them, the ones that should be thinking more critically, they were supportive of that. Similarly, on Ukraine, we have people come up and ask, well, what does Ukraine do? They don't do anything. We got, even our engines are from Russia, and our transport aircraft, the IL-78s, they're from Ukraine and they suck. Well, what's the argument here? The IL-78 was built in Russia. It just happened we got them surplus from Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are the ones who are helping helping us keep them active. And then on the other hand, when you're talking about, for example, the engines, I mean, I think you can speak to this as well, but like who is supporting us in developing the MRO facilities for those engines, right? It has actually been
Yeah,
Ukraine,
absolutely. A
not
lot of
Russia.
the support actually comes from Ukraine, particularly on the front of the RD-93, because obviously it's common with the RD-33, which the Ukrainians have tons of experience with. Ukraine is a powerhouse. For people to understand this, Russia themselves, until the Russian-Ukraine tension started, Russia themselves were importing key inputs from Ukraine, particularly marine propulsion. So when you made the point that the Indians had their deliveries delayed, it's because Russia themselves were importing gas turbines from the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians were a powerhouse and remained a powerhouse, and now there'll be an even greater powerhouse. The amount of data, the amount of knowledge and experience Ukraine has at the moment is, you can't put a price on that. You can't put any numbers on that. And the problem is the longer this goes on, we're less likely to get anything from this, right? And the key here is, Ukraine has experience in basically every industry, right? Ukraine has been making transport aircraft. Antonov, they make some amazing products, and there were some great offerings from Ukraine, and there were projects, but these were projects that Pakistan could have got behind. Even had like a three-way project between the Turks, the Pakistanis, and the Ukrainians for future transport aircraft, for example, which is something that we know the Pakistan Air Force is struggling with and doesn't really have tons of options for. Or Ukraine had been producing missile seekers. Pakistan has missile programs. Ukraine has been producing actually really capable air defense systems as well, and now has designs based off of all the stuff they've learned. Ukraine has been operating top-level air defense systems, so they know the weaknesses, they know the strengths, and they can combat. They can put that all into one really, really capable system. The point is Ukraine was a powerhouse and still is a powerhouse, and Ukraine has been supporting Pakistani programs for the longest of times, and they continue to do so. So the relationship is there, but this weird balancing act needs to stop. It's either you're with Ukraine or you're with the aggressors, which is Russia in this case. And Russia there's nothing to gain from a relationship with Russia for Pakistan. Russia refused to support Pakistan with the RD-93 MRO facilities, for example. So the Pakistani RD-93 facility is unlicensed. It's not an official facility. It's not recognized by Klimov. So if you approach them to say, okay, look, if a third country operator approach them, look, we need a Bangladesh, for example, that we need overhauls for our engines. They're gonna, what's the closest facility to us? They're not going to say Pakistan, because Pakistan isn't a licensed facility in their eyes. It was done with the Chinese and the Ukrainians and our own engineers to set up this facility. So the point is Ukraine has been able to help us for so long. And I'm going to just quickly intercept the comments that are about to come our way. You guys are Western biased, and you guys are this and that. No, the distinction here is the entire idea behind putting our weight behind Ukraine is that there is nothing to be gained from a relationship with Russia. Russia will never put its weight behind Pakistan because India is a cash cow. Just look at the Su-57 program, for example. The Indians wanted a twin seat. The Russians wanted a single seat. The Russians were so adamant about this that they refused, that they said, we're going to buy more single seats. You guys buy more twin seats and we'll split it that way. And now the Russians have suddenly produced a twin seat Su-57. The Indians are a cash cow for Russian industries because the Russians have been faltering ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. So they need a cash cow, and the Indians are that. We aren't. There is zero to be gained from a relationship with Russia for Pakistan, but there is everything to be gained from a relationship with Ukraine for Pakistan.
And just to add on to that, people accuse us of, again, as you said, in regards to pro-Western thing. But here's the thing: can you folks just stop counting tanks and planes and start counting the cash? Because here's the issue: the money that goes into funding those procurements from China and then those dream procurements some of you have from Russia. I remember those days. Some folks were asking like, when can Pakistan get the Su-35, for example? Unfortunately, we even used to write articles about that because we were following the news beat. But the point being is that the cash that would come to fund those procurements would come through our trade, i.e. exports to Europe, right? It would come from remittances from the Gulf, right? Not from Iran. I mean, there's a comment we had about someone accusing us of calling Iran an adversary. We're going to get to that. But the point being is that the actual things that we need in order to run a country and to build our defense, in order to buy whatever stuff you want from China and wherever, it comes through those economic and labor relationships that we have built with the Western world, right? Or maybe with the countries that are west, literally west to us, not east to us, right? Because the countries that are east to us either have us either sell us their stuff like China, or they cut off our water like India. That is the actual problem here, right? And this is the issue that we're trying to drill, is that when you look at defense and security, you cannot narrow your focus down to counting the number of tanks you're getting from China, right? This is how despot countries do it. If you want to be taken seriously as a regional power and beyond that one day, then you have to think across multiple domains, multi-domain, think multi-domain, right? Think across the economic domain, think across the industrial domain, think about the upstream domains, think about your diaspora populations, think about trying to build your hard currency inflows. This is the stuff that we write about in Goa more than anybody in Pakistan, to be clear with you, right? And this is what gets us the actual decision makers to listen to our podcast and stuff, right? And read our content, because we focus on all these things. So when we talk about a relationship with Ukraine, this is how we're thinking. We're not thinking about what products Ukraine offers today. Like, we don't care about the T-80 series tanks or the Oplot tanks, right? We don't care about, to be honest, they have some, as Arslan said, they have some pretty good emerging air defense equipment. I think they've even designed their own, anti-ballistic missile interceptor using basically whatever legacy technology they had and sort of rebuilt it using, modern production techniques. I mean, there's some valuable stuff there. But what we're focusing on is the upstream stuff. Ukraine is an industrial powerhouse. Right. Again, after Russia, Ukraine was the next big power within the Soviet Union. They have deep competency in everything from alloys, steel, composites, gas turbines, right? The critical stuff that you need in order to develop an engine. So, for example, one thing that the Ukrainians have been passing around to countries like in the Gulf and even Pakistan was that they had proposed developing basically like a, RD-93 slash F414 class type of engine. Basically an engine that could be used on a JF-17, or if you have two of them, on a J-35. But basically like a decent, 95 to 98 kN, kilonewton engine, turbofan engine. Now the Ukrainians, when they're offering this, they're not just offering like a diagram. They're offering actually their deeper industrial expertise, because they know how to build the gas turbines blades for those, right? They know how to architect the engine framework and design. They know the electronics of the engine as well. Like, they know how to develop all those things. What they need is cash and a partner that can help them with skill. Now, you're a country like Pakistan. If you're thinking multi-domain, as our leaders like to kind of like champion that word around now, if you think across multiple levels, you'll think of, hey, we have a dependency on engines. We depend on other countries for our engines. That creates a perpetual cycle of dependence for us. We're constantly vulnerable to what they think. We have to constantly align our policies to what they say. It also costs us money, and our industries don't really benefit from constantly importing engines. Hey, what if we partner with this country that's willing to develop engines with us, and then we can start getting some of those upstream capabilities? Because we can say to the Ukrainians, look, we will help fund this engine, but we need help in setting up A, B, C, D industries, basically. And we need these industries to also tie into other industries, like our naval industry, like our missile industry. Can you help us with that? These are the kinds of relationships that we're talking about. Russia is not going to do this, right? China has not been willing to do this, right? The pool of countries that have offered this have been like Ukraine, South Africa, Poland. It's a very particular list. And this list has one thing in common. These are what we call middle power countries. These are countries that have an incentive structure where they know they can't do everything, right? So they need to partner with other people to do, to basically achieve goals. However, what ends up happening in that environment, in that relationship, is that because you have two interdependent countries, both sides end up benefiting, because both fill in the gaps that the other has, basically. And this is the thing that we've been trying to communicate. So if you accuse us of being pro-West, we're not being pro-West. We're actually being pro-progress, because we're giving you an actual roadmap of how to make Pakistan a more developed country with better exports, with markets that will take our exports, right? As opposed to the alternative being is to count how many tanks we're getting from Europe. Like, that is not the equation. So just to put these points together, it's important that when you talk about national security, is to think across multiple levels, not just one or two. Because if you can think across one or two levels, then you're going to remain at level 1 and 2. You're not going to get to level 10. And that's basically our
And just
rant here,
before we
basically.
move on, I just want to touch on a great example. The Ukrainians obviously had the Antonov AN-140 project, which is a turboprop regional airliner, like small cargo aircraft, in like the CN-235 type class. And they actually also helped, using this project, they helped Iran set up a production line of these in Iran under the AESA Iran 140, which is a domestic production facility set up of the AN-140, which then obviously post-war, the Iranians went and basically de-Ukrainianed it and took all the Ukrainian bits out and replaced it with local Iranian ones to make the next derivative of it. So, it just goes back to the whole setting up of an industry thing and, allowing you to act autonomously. So, yeah, this is probably the best example of this, is the Iranians, who are now an adversary of Ukraine, were helped by Ukraine to set up their own industries. And Ukraine, as I said, has multiple areas where Pakistan really needs help in, particularly engine tech, turbofans. Asim will probably have talked about this on one of the Polshek episodes. Pakistan's biggest issue with its missiles, and we've spoken about this as well, is we're stuck using the turbojet engines, which aren't necessarily the most fuel efficient ones as well. The Ukrainians have turbofans in class. The Turks, their naval cruise missile, I think Gezgin or something, I don't know how to say it, but it's got a 2,000. They've quoted a 2,000-kilometer range on it using a Ukrainian turbofan engine. So the point is, there's so many areas for collaboration, but the only way you're going to get them is if you throw your weight behind them and stop walking this weird non-aligned tightrope, which has nothing to gain for us.
And just to sort of close the loop, because we started with the Russian air defense systems in Afghanistan, I know, and I make this mistake at times as well. I think the biggest urge a lot of people within Pakistan's policy circles and intelligentsia have is to go and immediately blame Afghanistan. You can only blame these guys up to a point where after that it becomes useless. Because the issue here is not just Afghanistan, it's the countries that are engaging with Afghanistan, right? Like that's the other facet of it. Like you can't have the argument both ways. You cannot say that the Afghans are, from your own narratives, like useless, untrustworthy, blah, blah, blah. And then at the same time, put them on this pedestal of being these major actors who are giving, they're giving you trouble at every turn. It doesn't, either they're a threat or they're not a threat, right? Now, yes, they can be a concern in the sense that, if certain things happen, for example, you have, as Arslan rightly pointed out, that they're importing MANPADS, and then those MANPADS proliferate across to the TDP and BLA. That becomes a problem for us. Yes, the question is not so much that them distributing the MANPADS, is the question, where are they getting them from? Where are they getting the loitering munitions from? Where are they getting, their small arms from, right? Because we know Afghanistan is not an industrial power. Well, the issue here from this perspective, and it's a very uncomfortable truth, they're getting this equipment from, at least the MANPADS from Russia, the loitering munition tech from China, because China is the main supplier. And here's a problem, you guys. China does not have good controls.
Because there's such an overlap between civilian and military tech in this field. Chinese export controls are really, really loose compared to what we have in the West. It's ridiculous, the strictness we have here. Whereas there, it's like, oh, well, this is, you can stick this, 10, 20 horsepower engine on an RC plane. Yeah, no problem, take it. And this is the problem is, at what point can you continue to turn a blind eye to these countries, continuing to arm our adversaries? China, but deeper than oceans, sweeter than honey, taller than mountains, whatever. Yet the Chinese equipment was found on the Afghan drones, and I'm sure that there was also probably a Chinese political element as well, preventing greater escalation between us.
Yeah. So the point being is that at the end of the day, look, for Pakistan to be taken seriously, it needs to take its red lines seriously, and it needs to establish some sense of consequence for actions that violate its interests or harm its interests. So, and that means, yes, you're going to have to stand up to the bigger power once in a while, right? Like the Russians, you have nothing to lose from the Russians not having good ties with you, because you're not getting anything. So at least aligning more closely with Ukraine and being more overt about it is not going to cost you anything from the Russians, right? That's like, let's be very clear there. That's, even the Russians will understand. They'll respect it. Like they will not agree with it, but they will respect it because they'll say, okay, Pakistan is a serious player. These guys are not kidding around. Then with regards to China, well, here's the thing, right? China also has an incentive structure. They cannot afford to have more US allies surrounding them, right? They cannot afford to have more adversaries surrounding them. They cannot afford to have another corridor to the Gulf getting closed down on them. They're already dealing with the fallout of the Strait of Hormuz. They're already dealing with the fallouts in the Strait of Malacca. With the Americans have already positioned themselves there. They're losing connection points to the Gulf and to their energy requirements, right? This is a real thing. And yes, don't let anyone gaslight you into believing it's not. It is a real thing. The Americans are operating on this in order to exert some pressure on China. Yes, industrially, economically, the Americans are having a lot of trouble with China. There's no doubt, right? But however, the Chinese still need access to the Gulf energy, right? And right now, more and more, Pakistan is looking like a pretty good option to maintain in the case that, the straits get completely, let's not say closed down, but they become completely vulnerable, right? Pakistan's the only access point that the Chinese can somewhat take for granted. And that is the issue, that we're letting ourselves be taken for granted, right? That our policymakers are not going out there and demanding hard concessions. I don't care about investment. I don't know. I want cash. I want cold, hard cash for any support that I render anybody. Done. People call me a mercenary. A mercenary. Go ahead. I don't care. Because at the end of the day, we are going to accumulate hard currency gains because that's what our economy needs, right? Your IPPs, I'm going to put an end to them. Sorry, done. Like you don't get the right, you don't have the right to go and basically obstruct Western investments in your country, and I cannot do the same thing in my country when those investments are hurting me. So those IPPs, gone. We're not going to tolerate any more energy oppression against our populace, right? We are going to get inflation under control, and we're going to have to take more aggressive steps to do it because we know that whether it's America, whether it's China, whether it's Iran, you all need us. You all need us. And that's what we're going to use as leverage. And that is how a policymaker is supposed to think, especially a policymaker who prioritizes national interests over God knows what we're prioritizing right now. We want to be at the table itself, right? And to be at the table, you yourself internally have to operate with some level of self-respect. And the problem is that structurally our policies do not demonstrate self-respect. And that's why everybody else is taking us out for a ride. And that is the issue. So, Arslan, next topic. So we caught a bit of a screen grab here from a PAF PR video. I guess like it was one of those like annual visits to NASTAP, but there's a couple of interesting tidbits here. So one is a apparent Saab 2000 structural update, and the other is I think continued development on the active ESA radar for PFX Alpha. So what are your thoughts on
It's interesting,
those?
right? Because, it's quite confusing also, like, a structural upgrade or update for the Saab 2000, the Saab 2000 is obviously a commercial airliner. It was designed for short hops. So, when we talk about aircraft, we look at two numbers, particularly when we look at aircraft life. So we look at cycles, which are like, in this case, pressurization cycles. So, how many times the airframe has been pressurized and unpressurized, so when we're flying and whatnot. And then the other thing is total hours as well. So lifespan, so the airframe hours. And, the Saab 2000 is obviously a regional airliner. So it's designed for a lot of cycles, a lot of pressurization cycles and short flights. So it's got it's designed to have a ton of life, right? I think it was like 60,000 cycles or I think there's 70,000 flight hours, something like that, right? So the point is the Saab 2000 is designed to have a ton of life in it. So needing a structural upgrade or a MLU at this point, I would be skeptical of. However, there's so it's quite we don't know what this is about, and I don't really know what the idea behind a structural update is. We'll see, obviously, as time goes on. But there is also another angle we could possibly look at this from. Is the Pakistan Air Force has always wanted a domestic airborne early warning platform as well, and we've seen tons of evidence from them implying that that's something they're interested in. So could this possibly be a solution, where they modify an area, a Saab 2000, because obviously we still have Saab 2000s in non-area configurations, into a platform or a testbed for a local airborne early warning solution? We're not sure, but there's just not a ton of information out there on what this could be about. But if I was to hazard a guess, possibly we could see some addition of maybe more sensors on board as well, because a lot of the areas it was focused on, the graphic, it was pointing towards stuff like the wing box or the cheek next to the cockpit. And these are interesting. They're not. It's one of those things where there's not tons you can say about this. But if I was to hazard a guess, maybe we could see some landing gear reinforcement, or like we see on the Brazilian R99, they've got cheek arrays for like ESM and whatnot. And it's the same we see on the E3 Century and stuff. So maybe there is a requirement for something like that, because we see that the Pakistan Air Force, its Erieyes aren't all the same. I think I can't remember what the number was now, but after a certain unit, they slightly differ in terms of configuration, and we could possibly see this as just maybe something to bring them all up to that same standard or same configuration. So yeah, it's one of those things where we have to just wait and see. But it's interesting that the Pakistan Air Force is continuing to develop the Saab 2000 and the Erieye platform, because obviously it's not necessarily the cutting edge, the latest and greatest, but we know airborne early warning has long life cycles, and we also know that Saab does offer a global eye upgrade, Erieye ER upgrade to the legacy areas. I think the Brazilians had it done. So, a continued investment into the Erieye platform, into the Saab 2000 platform, and trying to, let's say it's an extension of the life or whatever. I guess it does show that possibly these are here to stay around. And, at some point the radar would lose relevance, but the airframe will be, completely fine. These really reliable engines, great engines. There's not tons of the aircraft out there, but Saab tends to have great after sales support and whatnot. So maybe we could see this as a sort of like front runner to a possible Erieye ER upgrade, even if they're trying to keep these airframes relevant. But
yeah, I'm aligned on that, and the PF built a very good, I would say, in-house support capability for these aircraft as well on the back of repairing a number of them. Similarly, the Pakistan Navy is setting one up for the Embraers as well. So I think down the line, NRDI, especially given the fact that the NRDI, the Naval Research Design Institute, they have a MOU with Turkish Aerospace as well. So it could be possible that, again, like through that angle, we're seeing even the Navy start getting into like these bespoke customizations and development works as well. So it's very good to see that as well.
Yeah, and then I think the next point was that in the same still published by the Pakistan Air Force, we saw JF-17 AESA. And obviously, now the problem is the still was really low resolution, so we couldn't really see anything beyond that. But it just kind of aligns with what we've been talking about for the longest of time. Is I don't necessarily think the JF-17 Block 4 is the be all and end all, and obviously now we've got the PFX, so we see the Pakistan Air Force officially sort of confirmed to us that there's something cooking. Now, again, we've said this before, is we don't actually know what PFX is. But if we were to hazard a guess, or at least if I were to hazard a guess, it would be a Block 4 JF-17, which is basically just a more localized variant, particularly on radar and electronic warfare systems, because that's always been something the Pakistan Air Force has aspired to bring home. And that just kind of aligns with what I've been saying about a Block 4, or I guess you can call it PFX, whatever you want to, is that, it's probably going to be a local developed radar, which, as far as I remember, has been in the works since like 2018, 2019. And they've actually made some good progress with it. And a lot of it is, is genuinely good work and collaboration between industry and academia. So we obviously see that work being done there. And so I guess it probably just reiterates what we've been talking about is, we expect a local radar on whatever the next iteration of JF-17 is. And possibly the other thing I think is possibly a lot of the retrofit of the previous JF-17s will probably be with a local radar as well. We've not really seen anything be done to them. I would have expected by now for at least the first one or two JF-17 Block 2s or whatever to start receiving modern upgrades, modern AESAs and whatnot. But no, we've not really seen anything to indicate that either. And I don't even think we've seen the Block 2Bs be upgraded to Block 3 standards. So I just think that the Pakistan Air Force is probably waiting for something else and not necessarily the Chinese suite. Not necessarily because it's bad, but because there was always an aspiration to make the JF-17 at home as much as possible. And yeah, I think that's what they're trying to fulfill here.
Yeah, so just to clarify a couple of points. So there's a JF-17 OCU upgrade on the cards, and then there's the PFX Alpha, which based on the visual stills that we've seen previously, basically indicates that it's an upgrade of the JF-17. So from what I understand, based on this, is that PFX is more of like an umbrella program, which could include multiple pieces, among them being the JF-17 or upgraded JF-17, among them potentially an unmanned combat aerial vehicle, and obviously a crowning centerpiece, new next generation fighter aircraft. So I guess the next sections, we're just going to go through some audience questions and comments that we've got through across multiple videos. So the first one is this weird debate that's been happening as of late as to whether the JF-17 uses an air-cooled or liquid-cooled KLJ-7A active ESA radar. So for some background, the only times that have been that sources have reported on the KLJ-7A radar adoption. It was through Alan Warren's in one of his pieces on the PAF, where he basically said the PAF had the option of two Chinese options, but they ultimately chose the air-cooled variant of the KLJ-7A. Those are the facts that are available. There's no way to verify for or against. We typically just take Alan Warren's as his word as someone who defers a lot to what the PAF tells him, and he just basically reports that. So based on what he's reported, I don't know where the dispute is, what the narrative dispute is, basically, because if you look at the performance of the competing air-cooled radar, it was from, I believe, Letri. The performance parameters were not too far off from the KLJ-7 to begin with. They were quite comparable, and I think whether it was regardless of which radar the PAF chose, they were probably happy with those performance parameters back in like 2019, early 2020, because that's when this radar was selected. So it's also worth keeping in mind that this radar, the active ESA radar on the Block 3 is actually now 7 years old, basically, since the time it was first tested. So it's also, in the next few years, it'll become, I don't want to say obsolete, but it'll be amongst the older active ESA radars, as even the PAF is moving towards, transitioning the JF-17s towards a gallium nitride radar anyways.
Yeah, I just think it's quite an inconsequential thing. Like, clearly these radars were designed from the ground up to be air-cooled. They weren't an adaptation of a liquid-cooled system or whatever. So I just, so clearly they were designed in such a way that the parameters of, clearly they were designed in such a way that they're able to function at whatever the design requirements were, right? And that's with air cooling. So I just think it's quite an inconsequential thing to bring up as a talking point. Like, it's an air-cooled system, and it would perform better. Well, in theory, it would perform better if it was liquid cooled, but it clearly meets the performance requirements set out by both the designer and also the customer, right? And the other thing to mention and note as well is these systems have continued to be upgraded. When we look at the first public appearance of the LKF-601E, we saw that the performance numbers were actually a lot worse than what we saw in 2018, 2019. Whether we're talking about SAR resolution or whether we're talking about the detection ranges for the given cross section, they were a lot worse than what we had seen in 2018. So the point was that these are continued to be upgraded and continued to be optimized. So clearly the OEMs have managed to squeeze out more performance out of the same package, or maybe made further developments with the advancements of electronics and whatnot to these systems. So clearly, I think this focus on air cooling is just cope. Like, there's no other way to put it. It's just cope. There's nothing else about it. It's pure copium. It's an inconsequential thing to hold on about. A lot of AESAs are moving toward, a lot of these AESAs for these LCA class aircraft are moving towards air cooling anyway, because there are actual merits. The Phantom Strike, for example, is an air-cooled radar, offering in some antenna configurations similar performance to the F-16's radar, according to Raytheon. And even if we look at something like the LKF-601E, it was the OEM quoted a 170 kilometer detection range for a 3 square meter target, which is actually really, really good. Yeah, and I just want to preface this with it doesn't really mean much me discussing these numbers with you right now. You could have a really crappy radar with a huge detection range. It just doesn't mean a ton. But we can't really make any assertions beyond this because we don't have the details. But if we extrapolate this up to a 5 square meter target, for example, we're touching a 195 kilometer detection range. Or if we even take this bigger to 10 square meters, for example, we're talking about 230 kilometers, or all the way down on the other end to 1 square meter, we're talking 130 kilometer detection range. So it's a very capable system based off of this one specific number. And obviously stuff like the SAR resolution, that allows us to draw inferences about the radars, the processing capability of the computers and stuff on board. So I just think it's an inconsequential thing to talk about. It's an inconsequential talking point, and I think it's pure copium to drive views and make yourself feel good.
Yeah, and one other point, one reason why I could see why the PF might have picked an air-cooled version over the liquid-cooled version is that they might have thought about upgrading the JF-17Bs and especially the Block 2s, or maybe even the Block 1s at a certain point. Because I think the promise of the air-cooled, at least the Letri radar, was that it would be readily configurable onto even a Block 1, because I think they were testing it from a Block 1 prototype at some point in China as well. So it could be that the PF was thinking about that if for whatever reason they needed to, retrofit the existing JF-17 fleet as quickly as possible, that the air-cooled version might be a simpler fit. But now, with the passage of time and more options being available, they've basically revised that. That could be another
Yeah, and just one more thing. So if we look at a current, and this is one thing me, Asim, and Bilal have been talking about is, basically in every case, a TRM heavy, lower peak power radar versus like an older generation high peak power radar with fewer modules is always going to be better than the more power hungry radar. And the reason why I bring this up with air cooling is obviously with air cooling you need to be able to dissipate the heat of the radar. So by pushing less power through it, you've got obviously less heat to dissipate. And with the less, and this is obviously an assumption here because we don't know the ins and outs, but if you need less space for cooling and less space for ancillaries and whatnot, you could probably get a bigger array under the nose, right? And this, I believe this, the KOJ-7A is about, in excess of 1,000 TRM. So it's not a small array by any means, right? And it's quite a densely packed array. And as I said, in basically every case, a lower peak power, larger array is basically significantly better in nearly every scenario, particularly modern scenarios with really complex electronic warfare environments. And so obviously this is a really, really significant simplification. I'm not getting into the depth of it, but there's other considerations to make here as well. It's not just the cost. It's not just money. It's not just simplicity and whatnot. But there could also genuinely be a merit here where fair enough. There is always going to be a point of diminishing returns, and there's always going to be a point where one is better than the other. But in this scenario, it may have genuinely been the case that having something like the KOJ-7A versus an older system or a less capable system with more power and more water and a more efficient cooling solution versus just a bigger array. The bigger array with less power may have genuinely been a more optimal solution for this, without having significant degradation in performance or maybe even possibly superior performance. Who knows? But yeah.
Sweet. Now I think a natural starting point from there, we'll just start going through some additional audience questions and comments. So the next one is in regards to Pakistan's air-to-air and surface-to-air missile programs. So we have someone asking us to make a podcast on, I believe the FAAZ and LOMADS programs basically. So we touched on them in the past. I mean, there's not a lot we can say because again, the specific details around them, they're quite scarce in terms of what those missiles are and what have you. But I think the general idea is with, for example, the FAAZ series, there's an effort at play to building a platform. I think NESCOM is trying to build its competency in solid rocket motor technology so that it can develop more complex and capable air-to-air, surface-to-air missiles in the future. So I think the FAAZ program is an outcome of that. I think, Arslan, you have some views on it potentially being a technology transfer play from China as well. However, I think either way you spice it, I think at the end of the day, what it is basically these programs are an example of NESCOM just trying to build its internal capacity and capabilities for eventually taking on a more complex
Yeah, and I
project down
think
the line.
obviously they've signaled that they are looking to take on a more advanced project by, obviously having the FARS 2, which is a vastly different, but obviously based off of what they've given us. And obviously, I don't really hold the materials provided to us by Pakistani organizations quite in high regard. But obviously, there's some aspiration to make it something more complex out of it. In terms of the transfer of technology play, yeah, I think with the FARS series, it's quite interesting. It's obviously very, very much derived or inspired by the SD-10. Actually, the airframe is quite identical. And I don't know if the picture is public, but we've seen a picture of the FARS missile. I don't know if you remember, Bilal, but I've posted it. And it's a SD-10 for, the airframe externally is an SD-10, right? So we don't know about internals and whatnot. But, and that was as part of some certifications and testing on the JF-17. So what I think here is the Chinese have obviously moved on, right? They've moved on. And I guess it always does make sense that instead of just throw all the tooling into the bin, I guess you could probably make some money selling it off and recoup some of that investment, selling it off to people who want to buy it. And interestingly, we've seen North Korea pop up with their air-to-air missile program as well that looks quite similar to the SD-10. And now, obviously, we've seen Pakistan also pop up with an SD-10 program, and we know Pakistan have been producing SD-10s anyway. So, if the Chinese have lost interest, I don't see there being any sort of downside for them to just hand over the production facilities, or for Pakistan to just buy out whatever production materials it can and buy out a license to be able to produce these at home, because for Pakistan it's still seemingly relevant. And we see actually the Chinese as well. So there was an attempt by the Chinese to continue to repurpose the SD-10 into something modern via the PL-12AE, which was basically an SD-10 mated with the PL-15 avionics and basically the PL-15 motor forward, right? So the motor and everything was retained of the SD-10, but it was a PL-15 beyond that. So we saw the PL-15 Seeker, PL-15 avionics, we saw PL-15 fusing, and PL-15 fusing. So basically, it was basically a hybrid between the two, and it was quite a weird solution, right? Because who is that pitched towards, angled towards? And it was actually touted as part of a potential package for the J-35 as well. And it's just very strange, right? Like, who is that pitched towards? And I think again, it was kind of just a last ditch effort to sort of repurpose the remnants of the SD-10 production line into something that it might make a couple of quid for them. So yeah, I think this is very much a licensed production play. The Chinese have lost interest in the missile, and they've probably sold off whatever production kit they can. And Pakistan has obviously gone and picked some up or used whatever it's already got to then go ahead and continue to develop it further into something that something that it actually wants.
So what's interesting with the PL-12AE, I think I told you this as well. Like, if you go back to the KUA articles from like 2017, 2018, when we spoke to the PAF about the Block 3, I'd asked PAC at the time, hey, like, what air-to-air missiles are you going to use with the with the Chinese radar? Because at the time they didn't give it a name, but they kind of implied it was going to be a Chinese active ESA radar. And what the officer there at that time said was that the option on the table was basically, obviously they would continue using the SD-10s, but another option was a bespoke custom missile meant for the Block 3, right? Potentially as like an upgrade of the SD-10 or something like that. But he never mentioned PL-15. This is a big point I wanted to actually kind of raise. PL-15 or PL-15E was not mentioned at any level. What was mentioned was basically like a new variation of the SD-10 missile. And I wonder if the FAAZ program actually emanated from that conversation way back in like 2017, 2018, because now that you see the PL-12A, that in PL-12AE seems to align with that idea of an upgraded SD-10 missile. So you have basically the SD-10 motor and what have you, but then you have like basically the PL-15's front fuselage elements like the fuse, the seeker, and what have you. So it could be that was the original thing that was offered to the PAF for the Block 3, and then maybe when they negotiate with the J-10s, they're able to get the release for the PL-15/E, and they got those instead. But then NESCOM took on the PL-12AE side of the work and basically continued it with the FAAZ, and then I guess maybe is trying to branch out its own unique family through the FAAZ too. Now that being said, what I find really interesting and promising about NESCOM's programs is that one thing is NESCOM's customer base typically is either the Pakistan Army or the Pakistan Navy. And the Pakistan Air Force, with the exception of the Rad and Timur series, has in the Azab series, they haven't procured too many things from NESCOM. For whatever reason, they prefer now to work more with NASTAP. However, the good thing about NESCOM's, at least the project that they're doing, is that it seems that they're trying to reuse a common platform across both the air-to-air missiles and the surface-to-air missiles. And what that implies is that they're again focused on scalability. So I think, having seen what happened in May 2025, I think and also obviously also following what's been happening in Ukraine, they are trying to move, at least for the army, trying to move towards a scalable air defense sort of architecture where they're trying to produce a relatively affordable, pretty good, solid rocket-based surface-to-air missile system that they can use against, whether it's fixed-wing, aircraft, rotary-wing aircraft, or potentially missiles as well. And I think that's the angle they're trying to approach this from. So I think with that, it's likely that's the approach that NESCOM is taking. And with that in mind, I'm not sure how much viability like their next generation air-to-air stuff is going to have. I mean, I think I would expect them more to sort of, unless the Pakistan Air Force again starts working with them at a much higher level. But until that point, I think a lot of what they're going to do is going to be focused more on SAM applications, I think. And I think we'll probably hear more about a FAAZ SL sooner than we hear about FAAZ being inducted by the PF. That's just my thought.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, then again, a lot of the SAM stuff will have overlaps in the air-to-air category as well. And the sort of downside of FAAZ is you can't really tell the difference between a FAAZ and an ST10. Maybe obviously beside the serial number, but it's not exactly something easy to spot. So I know for a fact, and we know for a fact that FAAZ has gone through like separation testing or whatnot. So it's obviously something's being done there, and obviously there has to be something different about it, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be the need for all this like additional certification and validation and whatnot. So it's just one of those things where we just have to kind of wait and watch and wait for any signals, and when we do see them, we'll be the first ones to report on them.
Exactly. And obviously the ideal outcome would be our own proprietary dual pulse motor rocket platform, similar to the Turkish Hisar or the European CAM series or the Israeli Indian Barak series, right? Ideally, just a basically DPMR platform that we can then build and use a block building approach to extend the range with. That's pretty much the approach that we are seeing across the industry. So what I imagine is that NESCOM is really trying to get to that point. So yeah, that's basically the thoughts on that. But that being said, even in lieu of the PAF, apparently there could be an opportunity for NESCOM to deploy air-to-air missiles. It's through the Wafadar drone program that we've sort of spun out of thin air and has been making the rounds in the world. So again, it was a bit of a thesis that I had and I built with Asim and you, is that we think that at least Pakistan is working on at least one so-called loyal wingman UCAV project, 2 to 3 tons. The inputs to do it are all mostly available within Pakistan. It's an issue of design and integration work, which is then very difficult to do, especially with a still somewhat complex airframe. But I think we've heard from the people within the industry itself within Pakistan show quite a bit of interest and they started reaching out to us about this. So that's really cool to see. So I think I hope if any of them pull forward with a solution, please throw in a Kuwa Easter egg, like our logo somewhere. I think it'd be good validation for what we do. But that being said, I think in relation to that, we had a comment from someone, Tariq Khan. Basically, he's asking, discuss this concept of a loyal wingman drone in detail. What is it? How does it work or not? And why does the PF need it? After all, why can't these drones be programmed to do whatever without putting at risk the fighter pilots? Your presentation offers zero pushback for the concept. Again, not all ideas out of Western arm manufacturers are beyond criticism. You guys generally seem to think the sun rises in the west when it comes to doctrine. Ought Kuwa not to pursue a more critical, more targeted approach to these subjects, or is Kuwa more directed at Western audiences and professionals? So, it's a bit of a combo comment question. So let's just start with let's go at it with face value, and then I'll basically critique and unpack the rest in detail later. So this is a concept that has emerged largely on the back of the U.S. Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, the CCA. The idea being is that you would basically deploy these relatively low-cost 2 to 3 ton drones that could act as both a weapons carrier carrier plus a support asset for your crewed fighters. The idea is that, they're a low-cost way of deploying air-to-air and air-to-surface munitions at scale. They give your fighter aircraft a level, an additional asset to work with in the air, so they can operate as decoys. They can operate as obviously as buffer against enemy air-to-air missiles. And then you can also use them in a standalone way as let's say as like a drone that you can send across the border for high-risk missions. So let's say, in the next conflict with India, you want to target some additional S-400 or maybe even Barak 8 systems or what have you. I think they call them the MR SAM, for example. You want to target the radars and the batteries there. Instead of sending your crewed fighter aircraft, you might send waves of these drones across the border, knowing that a bunch of them, maybe all of them, are going to get shot down. But through these drones, you can definitely do more aggressive targeting and engagement. You can absorb hits from the enemy's air defense system. Maybe you can have these loyal wingman UCAVs drop small loitering munitions that can then also absorb additional munition stocks from India. You can use them to help expose Indian radar activity. Basically, a lot of things that don't involve sending a person across the border. You don't have to. And that's really what the core benefit of these drones is. I think the idea that we are just sort of parroting things from Western arms manufacturers and concepts is a bit disingenuous. I mean, I think anyone who spent any reasonable amount of time reading about these drones and putting one and one together to come up with two will understand that they have some inherent value in them. I mean, the fundamental idea is not that they're UCAVs per se, but that they're unmanned decoys and instruments that you can send in lieu of a person across the border. Because if you're able to examine an India-Pakistan conflict, you know that a fighter pilot who gets captured across the border is going to have a very demoralizing effect. So you would much rather send out drones first to deplete as much of the enemy's air power capability before you get to the point where you need to start sending your crewed personnel into high-risk missions. I mean, just because you have military personnel, it doesn't mean you recklessly send them into situations where they can get killed or captured. Rather, you want to deprecate the risk as much as you can before you send in your best assets, and your people are your best assets. So that is the angle that we're coming in from, right? That's just my thought.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly, I really want to start off with the criticism of his comment, and I'll go back to the original point, is just this, not all ideas out of Western arms manufacturers are beyond criticism. And this is a really silly point to make, because loyal wingmen and these kind of UCAVs are literally something everyone is working on. China, FH-97A, India, CATS Warrior. I'm sure the Indonesians and the Koreans are working together on something. Literally everyone. And it's not, the Russians, the Okhotnik. So this is, everyone, literally everyone. So this isn't a Western, even Saudis. So this isn't a Western idea. I mean, I guess it was a Western, it was a US, the US came up with the idea or whatever, but this is certainly not a West only thing. Everyone sees the inherent value of these systems, and and now we'll do a deep dive on this. So one of the things you mentioned, Bilal, is you'd like to send low cost systems, and I just want to touch on this because it goes back to something I mentioned before as well. Is I think there tends to be a misconception that UCAVs are inherently cheap, and this isn't the case. And particularly with these loyal wingman strike focused stealthy UCAVs, it's not necessarily always the case that they're cheap, because the cost of these, it really just comes down to the system itself. And we see the whole spectrum here. So for example, if we talk about the some of the higher end solutions, the Ghost Bat and the I forgot now, there was the Northrop Grumman solution as well. But then also on the other hand, we have the LCAT program, which is the low cost attritable aircraft technology program, which is the Kratos, and now that contract was won by Kratos via the XQ-58, and this is the complete other end of the spectrum, right? And the most notable sort of the key aspect of the LCAT was its emphasis on modularity and scalability, rather than relying on a single specialized airframe for each mission. So the key here was, we want to, on this end, we wanted to focus on cost saving, and Kratos actually quoted a cost of $2 million per unit for 100 airframes procured every year. So it's a very cost, there is the cost effective argument you can make, but also you can go ahead and talk on the other aspect as well. You've got UCAVs equipped with AESA radars and electronic warfare equipment and missile bays and everything. So it's a whole spectrum, right? But if we just go back to the fundamentals, the core behind manned unmanned teaming is, we see modern combat undergoing like a sort of structural transition defined because of these CCAs or loyal wingmen. And it's not just a like platform shift, but it's a doctrinal shift, right? We're moving away from isolated platform-centric warfare. And we've talked about this a lot, is, it's a systems of systems architecture, highly integrated, distributed systems of systems. And the core concept behind all this stuff, I think, is manned unmanned teaming, which is kind of, you've got autonomous or semi-autonomous platforms supporting as opposed to replacing replacing high-end as opposed to replacing high-end platforms. And they're designed to serve as force multipliers, right? And this concept allows for a lot more mission flexibility as well. As you mentioned, we don't have to worry about losing pilots, or we can take on far riskier missions, or do multiple. You could have a one strike package. One crew undergo, carry out top cover, carry out strike missions, carry out anti-ship missions, all in one, mission type thing, because you've got one crew acting as the central sort of node, and all these CCAs doing the conducting the missions. So, but if we look back at it specifically into the comments, so here, what it does, what is it? So, as I said before, it's like a doctrinal change where you've now got unmanned systems working together and also possibly working alone, right? And we'll touch on that. Working together and working alone to sort of reduce some of the load on traditional manned systems, but also be able to undertake some of the missions. But there's also other things you can look at. So, for example, you could see them as a missile carrier. For example, you've got your F-35 carrying 4 air-to-air missiles, then you've got your XQ-58 besides it carrying another 2, and you've got a couple of them, and you can send them forwards, to carry out a strike on an adversary aircraft without putting your own at risk. So, it's like. Yeah, like they're sort of there as a supporting, not as a replacement to your traditional fighter assets. How does it work? So typically, now you've got two ways of doing this, right? And we spoke about the Kızılelma last time, and the Kızılelma itself was initially designed as an unmanned fighter aircraft with a secondary MUMT role, manned unmanned teaming. So you could operate absolutely in a standalone environment where the drone is able to carry out its own missions based off of either like a ground controller or maybe like some preset missions. The Kızılelma actually carries its own radar and its own EW suite, ESM suite and whatnot. So you're able to, it's probably a far more flexible platform versus something like the XQ-58, which is meant to be on the lower end of the spectrum, and it doesn't carry its own stuff unless obviously configured that way. So, it's not black and white with these UCAVs. It's not like, okay, they either have to do this or they don't. It's a spectrum. And as I said, there are some UCAVs that are capable of doing everything, targeting autonomously, fly out there, return to base, carry their missions, do everything all in one. And there are some that aren't. It's just dependent on the system and the doctrine behind it. Other than that, how does it work? So as I was saying, you've autonomous systems potentially like the Kızılelma, and then you've got control systems like, let's say Kızılelma, controlled mode in like a manned unmanned teaming mode. And it's literally a case of, you could have a commander in the back of a JF-17B, tasking the Kızılelma to certain missions like air defense or like strike missions, and that data is fed by a data link or SATCOMs or that sort of stuff. So it's really like, again, like, how does it work? It's like, there's so much to it. Like, it's not something we can just touch on like this. I think maybe it might just be worth doing a whole separate episode on it, but it's a very big spectrum and there's so much to talk about. There's no one answer on how it works and how everything, it's not just one thing, it's a whole spectrum. And after all, why can't these drones be programmed to do whatever without putting at risk fighter pilots? They can. And that's what I'm saying. It's a big spectrum. There's no one type. There's no one solution. It's such a big spectrum. The Kızılelma can operate independently. Maybe something like a lower end or something on the lower end of the spectrum can't. But that's a design choice, right? Like it may have just been a design choice that it needs to operate with another aircraft, act as a missile carrier or whatever, or a sensor node. But it's just a spectrum. There is no one. It's either this or that. It's really a spectrum, and I think it's something maybe worth doing a whole episode about.
Absolutely. So next question is in regards to the Kızılelma. So from War Machine 76, the Kızılelma is not for sale, priority to our army, so completely sterile video. Anka 3.2, must read the report by Lockheed Martin for the F-35 with flying coffin. Okay. Anyways, Indonesia signed a deal with Bikar Technologies for the Kızılelma. So it's for sale somewhere. Next comment. Underestimating the Kızılelma. Greeting friends, you have greatly underestimated the Kızılelma. Never mind, don't buy it. Again, provided actual example or quote where we underestimated the Kızılelma. The closest thing I think we might have said was that we said that the Bikar group relies on the wider Turkish industry to develop it, which is 100% true. The radar comes from Aselsan, for example. The munitions, they come from Roketsan and Tubitak Sajis. So I don't know what the criticism here is meant to be. And then the last comment question is, and I think reading it multiple times, I might feel this might be somewhat sarcastic. So the guy might just be trolling in general. But he said, wow, you said your adversary is Iran. Who are you? An Israeli? Pakistan didn't have any military conflicts with Iran, and Iran was the first country to recognize Pakistan as well. And then there's some other details here, which seems to get into a bit of troll territory. But anyways, simple Couple simple points. The Iran that recognized Pakistan in 1947 was under the Shah. I think anyone who's a student of history would know that since the revolution, Pakistan's ties with Iran have not been great. Obviously, Iran literally, not too long ago launched ballistic missiles, a ballistic missile into Pakistani territory, and then immediately walked it back when Pakistan responded. So I'm not sure, when we say Iran is an adversary, it's a potential adversary in the sense that the current regime has relations with India. They have been supporting, for example, the Chabahar port as a rival to Gwadar port. And again, this goes back to our earlier point. Folks take Pakistani policymakers, unfortunately, for a joke. We don't enforce our interests, and others take us out for a ride. And here's an example of someone trying to tell us that Iran is on an adversary when the actions speak louder than the words themselves, right? I wish that Pakistanis and our intelligentsia would stop, getting into the habit of listening to words and saying words and get into the habit of measuring actions and taking action. And this is an example of it. So what are your thoughts, Arslan?
This comes back to people say, oh, Iran supported us, Iran did this, Iran did that. But it wasn't the Islamic Republic of Iran. It was under the Pahlavi regime, right? So this isn't the same Iran. People tend to see Iran as like this one continuous, state, right? Like that's not the case. So firstly, the Iran that recognized us, as you said rightly, is not the same Iran it is today. But on top of that, I just ask one thing: if India or if Afghanistan launched ballistic missile strikes on Pakistan, what would you have said? Would you have said that they are somebody worth negotiating with? They are somebody that is an ally. They are somebody that we've had a long, rich history with? Or would you rightfully say that they're an adversary or they are somebody we need to respond to? I just don't understand why the same argument doesn't apply to Iran. And I once again want to and this ties back to the initial point, is what is there to gain from a relationship with Iran? I understand Iranian oil is cheap and whatnot, but firstly, are our refineries even set up to refine that kind of oil? I don't know. It's not really something that I focus on. Maybe this is something you can touch on, Bilal. Is the economic and the political and the defensive benefit of pushing for closer relations with Iran? But the comment also, and this is where I will sort of tear this apart a little bit, is the comment also says, we have zero concerns with Iran except for our Arab sugar daddy, the Saudis. And this is, again, it goes back to the initial thing we were talking about with Ukraine. It's like, well, if you put the Saudis and the Iranians in front of each other, and I'm no super fan of our policies and the things we've done together with the Saudis in the region. I'm no super fan of this, right? But if we put both together, and you tell me which one has a greater net benefit for Pakistan, is it a strong relationship with the Saudis or a strong relationship with Iran? I'm going to go ahead and say it's a strong relationship with the Saudis. The Saudis hold tons of remittance for us. They keep us afloat effectively. They finance our war economy. They finance our purchases, defensive purchases. There is no comparison. I can go on forever. There is no comparison. The Iranians, let's just assume there is some. I just don't know off the top of my head, and maybe you can talk about the economic benefits. But let's just also talk about, the Iranians hold proxies within Pakistan, right? Like there is no way a country that actively supports proxies within your country can be an ally. I cannot work it out in my mind. It just doesn't. It makes no sense, right? And I think a lot of this just comes down to this idea that we need the US out of our region, we need the West out of our region, we need to align with the global East and the Axis countries, Iran, Russia, China, and whatnot. And it's like the Muslims have been done wrong by the US and whatnot. And I think that's typically a lot of the sentiments people have. But it's quite a hypocritical sentiment, I would argue, because the Russians haven't exactly been the great Muslims, I don't know if you remember during the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, the Armenians complained that their Scuds weren't working or their Scuds weren't great. And you know what the Russians did to advertise the effectiveness? And this is, the video might still be up, and if it's not, you can Google this. The Russian Ministry of Defense published a video of a Scud being dropped on a hospital in Syria, an operational hospital in Syria, as proof that the effectiveness of the missile is true and what the Armenians were saying is false. Just think of that for a second. So if you want to come here from this angle that Muslims are being killed and there's extreme injustices being conducted towards Muslims as a result of the West, I've got a wake up call. It's the same everywhere. The East is no saint. The East is no Putin might put out a couple of statements here, respect the Quran, blah blah blah, but that doesn't stand for anything. Their actions don't align with this. That aside, sorry, back to the original point. You can't sit there and have an ally that supports proxies within your country, that launches ballistic missile strikes on your country, that supports your adversaries. It just doesn't make sense. There's no, and the other argument people make, is the Iranians, they act as a buffer against Israel in the region. Hello, wake up call. During the war, we saw the effect, the Israeli, how effective Israeli activity within Iran on launching strikes on Iran from Iran was. So clearly, if the Iranians haven't been able to stop Israeli activity in the region against themselves, how the hell are they going to stop Israeli activity in the region against Pakistan? They aren't. That's the wake-up call. We've seen Indian, Yadav, whatever his name was, he was captured from, he was captured coming in from Iran. So, if Iran isn't able to stop intelligence activity against Pakistan, and Iran is actively supporting insurgency and proxy groups within Pakistan, actively launching attacks on Pakistan, there's not really significant industrial collaboration, there's not really significant economic collaboration. What's the point? Why take sides with somebody there is no massive net benefit here? What's the point? That's why I asked you, is what's the point? And I'm just going to leave you with this to think about before I pass it over to Bilal again, ask yourself, if tomorrow the UAE or forget the UAE, if tomorrow Nigeria launched ballistic missile attacks on Pakistan, would you go ahead and say Nigeria is a strong ally, we should carry on working with them, we should ditch our traditional allies, whatever, and we should stick with the Nigerians? Or would you rightfully say that the Nigerians have launched an attack on Pakistani territory and we should respond rightfully, and we can't be allies? This isn't how allies work. And I just let you think. I'll just leave you with that point and then pass over to Bilal now.
Yeah, and you become an active agent of your own interests, right? You don't tie yourself to other people's bandwagons, right? So, for example, what we have is in Pakistan a habit of sort of appending ourselves to other countries. Append yourself to Russia, China, and Iran, right? Append yourself to the so-called Axis. Append yourself to the Americans. Append yourself to the Western alliances. No more appending. We need to operate as an independent country with our own national interests. We do have vital national interests. We are completely ignoring those vital national interests. We have no answer as to what India is doing with regards to our water, right? We have no answer with regards to how we're going to secure cheap and reliable carbon energy. Yes, we are energy dependent. That is a problem. What is the solution? Right? Like who is thinking about a way to make this a solution, given the fact that we don't have a lot of hard currency to work with? What options do we have? Well, let me look at the situation. I noticed that the Gulf might have a lot of oil and they might have a lot of money, but they seem to have a real deficit in terms of security. It seems that, they really tend to prefer and benefit from having maybe additional soldiers on their ground. Maybe they don't feel too comfortable with just relying on America. Maybe we can step in and offer to underwrite their security. Maybe we can step in and offer our troops and personnel to help them when things get hot. Maybe we can use that as leverage to get cheap energy, or maybe even free subsidized energy. Maybe we can use that in addition to other security guarantees, maybe a nuclear umbrella. Maybe we should have the guts to talk about a nuclear umbrella once in a while, right? This is the stuff you have to bring to the table in order to compete at the stage that we're in right now. Because unless you do that, then you're constantly going to see, let me put it this way. If you're ever wondering why things don't get better in Pakistan, it starts out here. It starts with international relations. It starts with our inability to pursue our national interests across our economy, across our geopolitical interests, across our military security interests. It starts with our unwillingness to draw red lines and enforce them. That's where it starts. And then it goes downstream from there, right? And then when the failure begins to really manifest, that instead of solving the problem, unfortunately, our policies and our incentive structures force our leaders to essentially double down on what they're already doing, which is failure, and then create more issues for the population. The strategy for improving your life in Pakistan is try to get into the armed forces. If you can't get into the armed forces, try to get into the government, right? If you can't get into the government, then try to leave the country. If that is the mentality everyone's going to hold, then we're going to have a lot of issues. But we're here trying to articulate the solutions. And it starts with this. It starts with enforcing your national interests and not taking these other governments and establishments for granted. Believe it or not, everybody has a vulnerability, right? And you have strengths that you can play to. Just be brave enough to draw on those strengths, right? That's what we're basically calling for here. And don't append yourselves to the next power that offers like nice, sweet words. We don't want words, right? We want actual net benefits here. And that's the point that we've been trying to make. And in accordance to that framework, we're going to call out countries that attack our territory. So that is the approach we hope Pakistan's leaders will start taking eventually. Any thoughts, Arslan?
No, I think that sums it up pretty well, and I'm sure we're going to have a ton of comments to talk about next week based off today's discussion.
Be sure to leave your questions and comments, and we'll get to them by the next episode, hopefully. So once again, take care and bye.